Thank you everybody for joining us today. Just bear with us for a moment as we allow everyone to come in through the waiting room. Let me just point out that we do have closed captioning enabled for those who would like to turn it on their end. We also have the question and answer panel for folks to put in their questions. In just a moment, we'll get started. Thank you for being with us today. The session is being recorded. Welcome, everybody. This is a conference from the Program on Education Policy and Governance. Thank you all for joining us this morning. Let me introduce the director of the program, Professor Paul Peterson.
Thank you, Antonio, and welcome to this third session of our conference on school choice in the post-pandemic era. This conference is a virtual conference, of course, and it's held weekly on Friday from 12 to 1 through December 10th. It is sponsored by the Program on Education Policy and Governance here at the Harvard Kennedy School. I am Paul Peterson. We at PEPG are excited to have so many people joining us today to discuss exactly where the school choice movement is today. Is it a house divided? Now, at least in the period leading up to the pandemic, there seemed to be a waning of support for school choice. Among Democrats, only 34% say they are supportive of charter schools, whereas 52% of Republicans are. The differences on school vouchers are even greater among party leaders, though not necessarily among the public at large. In today's session, we're going to consider the question of private schools, charters, homeschooling. Can they cooperate together, or are they three different movements out there? Before we turn to our speakers, I wish to recognize Antonio Wendland, Nick Tavares, and Michael Poor, who carried the heavy administrative tasks associated with this session. But let me introduce Daniel Hammond, who has helped organize the conference. He's a professor of education at the University of Oklahoma, and he will introduce our featured speakers. He's an expert on school choice, and he is a terrific moderator. So let me turn the floor over to him. Daniel?
Thank you, Paul. So we're going to get to the session question right away, but first I just want to quickly introduce our panel. It's a great panel. So our first panelist is Jim Blue. He's co-founder of the Defense of Freedom Institute, also called DEFY, which promotes educational choice. He previously served as Assistant Secretary for Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development in the U.S. Department of Education, and he was also National President of Students First. Our second panelist, we have Robert Enlow, who is President of EdChoice, which is one of the nation's leading advocates for school choice. And his work on school choice is regularly featured in the media, as well as scholarly journals, books, and many research papers. And last but not least, our third panelist is Derrell Bradford. He's president of 50CAN, an education advocacy organization that seeks to link local leaders across the country with the aim of building better education systems overall. Previously, he was executive director at Better Education for Kids, where he worked to secure the passage of tenure reform legislation in the state of New Jersey. So before we begin, just a quick note to the audience. We do want to hear from you, and we hope that you'll pose some questions for the panelists. We don't need a lot of context around the questions, and if you pose a more succinct question, that'll allow Paul and I to identify the question and field it and pose it to the panelists. So with that, we're going to start off with each presenter having about 3 to 4 minutes to give their thoughts on the session question, which is the school choice movement house divided? And then we'll talk a little bit about each other's responses. So Jim, if I may, could we start with you?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me today. So I wrote about the factions within the education reform movement and also within the school choice movement in a recent EdNext article. I'd encourage people to read that so that I don't have to cover it right now. I will come back to the question of the house divided, but first I wanted to make some larger points about the post-pandemic era and the impact that's having on the school choice advocacy efforts. I'm projecting here, but I think in the next couple of years, we are going to really regret how we behaved during the pandemic. It's very clear at this point that children were harmed. They were harmed physically, they were harmed emotionally, socially, and we have accumulating evidence that there was a lot of academic harm. To add on top of that, I think over the next 3 to 5 years, our regrets, our remorse about how we as adults didn't do everything possible to reopen schools, it's going to be even more pronounced. And the reason for that is that we are still largely across the country using an industrial model. And that industrial model has never before figured out how to remediate children, to make up for some of the harm that we've caused over the last couple of years. And by the way, I say we because I think all of us should have done more as adults. And there were adults out there who did a fantastic job reopening schools. And so I want to just point them out as heroes, but say for the rest of us, for so many children, they did not get the benefits of in-person instruction this last year. And we should have done more. But then you put on top of that, like the model has never figured out how to remediate students, certainly not at scale. There are some individual programs that have done good work, but I am predicting now that the industrial model is not going to do any better over the next 3 to 5 years. So I want to end this on an optimistic note, which is that there is a way out of this. And I think that it lies with our educators, particularly our entrepreneurial educators, because I think they're the only ones. I should sort of do what you should never do, which is sort of divide teachers into 2 groups for a second. And I understand there's a lot of teachers who are very comfortable with the industrial model. They really sort of enjoy the teaching to the average student, being the average teacher. And I do think there's a place for that still. But where we're going to see breakthroughs is if we break that model and start meeting children exactly where they are and lifting them up, cultivating them to reach their full potential. And I think the people best suited to do that are the educators in this audience and across the country. That said, those are my introductory comments. In the article about what we should all learn from the DeVos era, I did go into the factions within education reform. There are many of them. I have, since writing that article, come to the conclusion that not only do we have a house divided, but that's a good thing. That the diversity of opinion about how we fix our school system is sort of natural because it's a really complex problem. And there are people who are going to be completely devoted to one type of charter school scaling up and serving many more children. And God bless. There are other people who want more of a permissionless self-discovery item. God bless them too, because I think all of these ideas have to be thrown in the mix. And then we have to let parents choose what's best for them. So we move away from what we have to a system of choice and competition. So Paul, Daniel, thank you. Looking forward to hearing others.
Thank you, Jim. Robert?
Good morning, and thanks so much for having me. Robert Enlow, President and CEO of EdChoice. I loved Jim's last comment. He started as saying we need a system of choice and competition. As the head of the former Friedman Foundation for Educational Choice, I would argue that's a great thing. I'm also sitting in an interfaith chapel, which is an interesting place to sit for a conversation about a house divided. And The answer that I would give is yes and no. But I do want to come back to Jim's comments a little bit about the pandemic and make a few before I say what I mean by yes and no. There's no doubt that the pandemic harmed kids. It's harmed it, and it harmed our society as a whole. And there's also no doubt that adults in the traditional system, the industrial model, not all of them, not educators, but the adults who ran it did not respond effectively. They did not open schools in the right ways. They did not listen to what parents wanted, but parents did actually respond in many ways. Parents did create their own environments and their own opportunities. Private schools and charter schools were actually far more adept at getting an education to parents than the traditional system. There's a reason why 7 out of 10 parents now, according to our polling, want multiple learning options, even if they go back to school full time. This idea of multiple learning environments is something I think parents have seen. I think they've also seen what happens when you pull the curtain back on education and they sit on some asynchronous Zoom calls, or they sit on a synchronous Zoom call, and what does that mean to them? You also see parents, particularly low-income parents of color, saying, I don't want to come back to the system for a lot of reasons, right? They have been most harmed by that system, but they've also been very, very strong on supporting homeschooling. Our data shows that more and more families are homeschooling, more and more families trust homeschooling and the idea of homeschooling. And so I think the concept of trusting parents and educators to do what's right for kids as coming out of the pandemic is an important point. As to a house divided, yes, I think there is a diversity of opinions and solutions, and I think that's a good thing. And I think we should continue to have that fight. And then no, on the sense of, if we actually listen to the people who are in the system, the actual educators and the actual teachers, a multiple level, diversely delivered system of educational opportunities, not run by one top-down structure, is what that they want. And if we can align behind what actually parents and customers and families and educators actually want and tell us they want, which I think is a shock about the traditional system. They don't often ask parents what they want. They just say, we'll tell you what you can have. And I think if we get around that, we won't be as divided, even if we have different ideological groups.
Thank you, Robert. Derrell.
Thank you, Professor Peterson and Professor Hamlin, for having me today. It is nice to be in such august virtual company as I come to you live from my hotel room in Denver. So the background is not a Zoom background. There's so much to sort of address between like Jim and Robert's comments, but there are a couple of things I sort of want to get on. The first thing is generally about the pandemic. I feel I want to be like a little more acerbic about it. The American public education apparatus failed in ways we have been talking about, intimating, right, sort of given to people on the sly, and all of a sudden it was just out there for 60 million families to see, right, in high and broad relief. And I totally agree with Jim's point about the fact that there were some Herculean state chiefs, public school educators, and whatever all across the country who moved heaven and earth to make sure that kids got an effective education. And I'm like, I'm not even picking like in person or out of person. I'm saying like something that was effective, that worked for a child. And I commend all of them. But if you are a Black kid in New York City, you are the least important person in America for the last 2 years, right? And if you were a teacher in that system, you were the most important person in America for during that time. And we made it very clear and explicit that that was the case, right? So we have a system that is built upon that foundation with those priorities. And it couldn't get the majority of kids reading proficiently before the pandemic, kind of to Jim's point. And that is the thing that people want us to take the home run bet on right now, with no data and another $190 billion to dig out the hole that it threw all the kids into. So I just think we got to keep it real about that thing that is out there. And I've become increasingly frustrated that people, in the spirit of sort of good humor, want to kind of act like none of that offense, none of that pain happened, right? Like, let's put it behind us. Let's talk about getting back. And so I just can't do that. The polling says I should do that, but I can't do it. So that was the first thing. The second thing, kind of to Jim's point, you know, if you talk to the average like Black low-income family, which is to say my family, like 40 years ago, even before there was any public policy in place for anybody to go to any kind of school, like in the pre-charter school era, like we were navigating a world of school choice. The way we were doing it was somebody was lying about an address, somebody was getting a scholarship somewhere, somebody was testing into Poly or City or whatever, right? The regular people are diverse delivery people, right? Just all the time we are diverse delivery people. And one of the things that has frustrated me the most in talking about sort of the house divided, I want to get to the actual question, is that we have a universe of people who are divided about what the option should be, which is fine, right? But they're singular about the fact that their option should be the only option, which is not fine, because that is not how families experience trying to get the best education for their child. You know, like, and American children are as diverse as American adults, and as diverse as a great society, and that is a strength of who we are, not a weakness. Last thing on this, I do think we are divided, but over something different, and it is important. I think there are people in the school choice world who believe that the purpose of our work is to help families and kids match with educational experiences or institutions that meet their values and help them become the best versions of themselves. And then they go out into the world and are free and help build our society. That is like one group of people. The other group of people have a very clear notion of what society should be like and want to bend the institutions to produce the people that live in that world. And there, I think there is a clear and present division that is presenting itself sort of like more deeply and sharply given the current political context than it has in the past. And again, thank you very much for having me today.
Paul, you're muted.
My apologies. I'm changing my question because of the comments that you have all made about the opening remarks that Jim, they were very penetrating, those opening remarks, but I feel like you're all a bunch of Monday morning quarterbacks who are saying, oh, this is what the quarterback and coach did last Saturday. That's dreadfully wrong. So what did you expect schools to do on March 15th of 2020 when all of a sudden, the CDC is saying, the world's going to hell in a handbasket. We all got to climb into our houses and never go outside the door. I mean, this was a dramatic moment that we've never experienced before. Aren't you being unreasonably harsh? What would you have done? What exactly would you have done? And when would you have done it? So Jim, you had your hand up, so I'm going to go back to you with that question.
Okay, and first of all, that's a fair question, Paul. It's hard being a quarterback, and it's easy to be a critic. However, we have a natural experiment. There were places in this country where the adults pulled out all of the stops to make sure that students were learning. One of the reasons I raised my hand for the panel is that Derrell corrected me on something, and it's really important. Michael Horn and others, as we moved into the remote instruction, said this is going to give remote instruction a really bad name. And it was, because the people who've been trained in the industrial model really did not know how to transition to a remote instruction. But there are lots of people in this country who had figured that out. They did a good job. They did a better job as the pandemic went on. So it really was about learning. Thank you, Derrell, not just about in-person instruction. My shorthand was, because of the state of our system, that the best option for many children would have been in-person instruction, and they were deprived of it. They were shut out of it. And that had to do a lot with politics, union bargaining, and we're happy to talk about that some more as well. So anyway, back to your real question, Paul. That natural experiment where we see what private schools did, where we see what charter schools did to make sure students were continuing to learn and to have healthy social interactions. that can be contrasted with what much of the system did. And I'm with Derrell and Rob. This was a complete failure for those kids, and we heard.
So Robert,
So
put your hand up.
I did, and first of all, the characterization of Monday morning quarterback, I appreciate, but little for me, I'm a lineman, and your answer to your question is this: any doggone thing we could have done to gain an inch, or a mile, or a yard. The reality is the system failed because the adults failed. And the adults failed because they had a lack of vision and a lack of clarity and a lack of what the goal was. So instead of embracing all of these incredible learning opportunities, all these incredible privately provided stuff, homeschooling provided stuff, the legislatures and the government came along and said, no, only this kind of education, only this kind of way, only this kind of thing. And instead of empowering things from the bottom up, we, like always, said, hey, we have a better idea. Let's go from the top down. So to me, the answer to your question is we could have tried a lot. And this system, as we all know, as Derrell said, it's been dropping out about 1 million kids a year for the last how many years now? 25, 30 years. And no one gets upset. They say it's more money. And I think this is a real question for us to think of as a society, saying, is this model the model we need to hold on to in order to educate and learn for make sure our kids learn? And I'm not sure the answer to that is yes, because to me, and I'm going to say something I know I'll get in trouble with in my office here, and that is, I kind of wonder if the traditional school system is like an engine that has gotten no oil for the last 20 years, and it's finally seized. And I'm really worried about that because I think it affects so many kids, and we don't have enough thinking to change that and create multiple learning environments.
And Professor Peterson, this is a rare instance where I've actually done homework and have more than just an opinion. We did, and I can remember I was in Georgia. It was the last time I left my apartment basically for like 1.5 years when New York City public schools were shut down. And I was tweeting with a New York Times reporter decrying, let me just be straight about it. I was talking about what an idiot Bill de Blasio is, which I think is like commonly understood knowledge at this point, because he didn't want to close New York City public schools, and Success Academy had closed that Friday. So I was at the front of the line, close everything. So I just want that to be clear. At the same time, it became very evident to me very early that we needed to get that the ideological fight over like virtual options was not worth having. We needed to get good at virtual, right? Like for the data we had said that if people came together, kids and families might die. So we needed to get good at virtual. And there were a lot of people, teachers unions among them, who were against that because like getting good at virtual was going to threaten their market share. They came right out and were explicit about the we need in person, but didn't want to open anything up. It was like this anti-competitive response. And then later in the summer, our CEO and we co-wrote 2 briefs. One was called Fund Everything, which was about building a system of flexible finance that was meant to help parents address literally the day-to-day decision-making that the pandemic foisted upon them when they were trying to organize their kids' education. And that meant like, hire a tutor, make a pod, cross a boundary, enroll in a virtual thing, like just everything needed to sort of be on the table. And we wrote another paper called Measure Everything because we wanted parents to know, like, and that was like apps and platforms and all these other things. And then we wrote another brief in the spring about the system we could have using ESSER money as a way to kind of like thrust us into that. And that's like a permanent virtual option, right? Like a permanent tutoring option. It's like all of this enrichment that we could pay for with an extra $5,000 a kid, right? Because we know, and I think everyone has talked about this, that if you missed a reading window in the last 1.5 years, the cost and the effort to get you back up to speed are enormous, right? And it's just, we couldn't do that before the pandemic. Like it's a mistake to believe that we could just double down on the inefficiencies of the same system trying to spin itself back up to solve those problems. So I very much respect your pushback there, but I do think that by like November, it was clear that something else needed to happen. And instead, and the political leverage was not around designing a system or systems that helped that other thing happen. It was around extracting the maximum amount of money from the federal government by keeping schools closed. And people made that choice deliberately.
So Daniel, move us forward here.
Yeah, okay. Well, I do think we can try to pivot to the session question, but we do have a relevant question in the chat from the audience here that I think relates to all of your comments to some extent. So I think to some extent, a lot of your arguments are based on parents and maybe even children just being able to make the right decisions for their education. And in the chat here, it says, what evidence do we have that parents know what's best for their children educationally? So what does the empirical evidence say about that? This comes from Patrick Wolf, and I think even and Professor Wolf can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think even some of his research suggests that in some cities, maybe something like 1/5 of parents just they report that they won't choose no matter what the circumstances are, that they're just not going to participate in school choice. So I think that maybe raises some interesting questions as well. So what do you all think about that?
I expected Derrell to jump all over this, and since
Pat Wolf, the subversive, is that?
yes, he's throwing us a softball on it. So Derrell, really, this is one you should pick up for us.
Yeah, I just think that like there's no other place in society where we sort of actually I don't want to give that answer. So two things. I think it is not a good policy choice to deprive 80% of the people who will use data and make a decision of the ability to do so, because 20% of the people will not, right? And I just think that we are always having this conversation about parents, and I know Patrick does not believe this, but we're always dividing up parents like the school choice house into those who are sophisticated and well-heeled enough to make good decisions about their children. I would just let everybody know that rich people make bad decisions about their kids all the time, and nobody says anything about it. So I want to put that out there as a measure of truth. But like, you know, we have to regulate the hell out of everything, because like one parent may make a bad choice, and that's not a good system. That's the system we have right now, right? And it is not up to the task of the everyday, let alone the extraordinary. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing, and it's a little anecdotal, but so I'm on the board of Success Academy. It's a big charter school network in New York City. We got like 22,000 kids, so that's a moderately large sample size. And one of the things that you find is that like parents make a decision based on sort of like word of mouth, brand, right, story at the front end that is meant to sort of meet like key thresholds for parents. And here's a key threshold for a parent, right? And we should respect this one. Will my kid come home alive at the end of the day, smarter than the day before, right? Emphasis on alive, right? This is there's nothing pejorative about this question. This is a very important thing. But a parent at the front of the pipeline is asking very different questions than the parent who's in the middle of the pipeline, having had experience with the system, having seen the effects of it, having looked at the data themselves, having built vocabulary around what the school experience is. And they ask for different things. And the questions are often penetrating and incredible, and they have a huge impact on what we do as an institution. So I, for one, am a great believer in people. I'm a great believer in learning, and I think the experience of choosing anything is one of the most powerful things that the human heart and mind can experience, and overall we are better off for being able to do so.
Well, Derrell, I want to ask you this question to follow up. The country has divided itself between the red states and the blue states. Unfortunately, not many purple states around, it seems. But we've seen a lot of school choice initiatives in the past few months in the red states. We mostly tax credit expansions, education savings accounts. But we have seen very little in the blue states. I mean, they have hardly budged. So the talk about the pandemic a parental opinion. They're ready for more. We should be seeing this across the country. We're seeing it rather lodged in one side of the political spectrum. How do you make this a bipartisan movement? How do you broaden the base for the school choice movement?
Yes, that does matter to me a great deal. And I'd like two quick answers on it, sir. And then I know Robert and Jim will probably want to chime in. So one of the things I think is important to consider when talking about like the expansion of school choice policies over the last year and a half is that two things happened. More people showed up and different people showed up to be upset about the state of closed schools. So our movement, right, the movement I got into to help low-income folks of color in particular without a lot of choice to have more of it, politically has kind of reached a ceiling above which it cannot go unless its constituency is broader in terms of location, income, and ethnicity, right? Like, let's be clear about it. So over the last year and a half, a lot of upset white people showed up in red states that liked their schools before, and suddenly we're in it. And then people are like, oh, this tax credit is great. Let's pass the tax credit bill, right? Like in Montana, let's change charter school authorizing, right? What maybe not is Wyoming, right? So we shouldn't ignore the politics of that. The thing I think is most important, though, sir, in terms of diversifying constituency, is remembering that different parents want different things. And our policy paradigm has only been about buying a seat in a different kind of school. And I think what we need to do is get to one where it's like, well, I like my school, but I need to plus it, you know? I am getting this thing from my school, but I don't want to be there 5 days out of the week. Like I'd like this experiential thing, you know, whatever. My kid needs a tutor and goes to a Catholic school, something like that. And we need to build a finance system that pays for those decisions. And to me, that is a huge evolution of how we talk about school choice, right? We're trying to sharpen a consumer instinct in a lot of people, and that to me is the blue state, red state paradigm. Because if you live in New Jersey and you're paying through the wazoo to get free, free school that's priced into your mortgage, but you need help on lacrosse sticks, right? That is as urgent a need as if you're in a rural town and you want to be an engineer and you need a virtual option to get physics because the local district can't afford to hire a physics teacher. So that would be my proposal.
So Jim, what would you do?
Well, so this question always frustrates me, Paul, and I'm going to explain why. There is no reason this should not be a bipartisan issue. If you look at the polls, you'll see among the public, Republican, Democrat, they all embrace the concept that people should be able to choose their school for their child, school choice, education freedom, whatever you want to call that. So what's happened though in the last several years is that people have lost sight of why this became a partisan issue. And so I'm going to get myself in trouble and explain why that's happened. They often blame Betsy DeVos for suddenly it becoming partisan. And I just there are no facts behind that. She spent a lot of her personal wealth, the American Federation for Children, that she was the chair of, was very bipartisan in who they supported. But ultimately, they have failed to convince Democrats that this is something that's good for the country. And there's a political reason for that. About 50 years ago, the labor union that represents teachers in collective bargaining, but also in elections, decided it was going to take over the Democratic machinery, policymaking machinery, and they now own it. And they've been very successful at their strategy. And it is very hard to be an elected Democrat official and stand up and say, actually, what's the matter with having a charter school in my neighborhood where the public schools are not performing very well? They've quickly learned that is blasphemy. And if they take that position, they will no longer be in elected office. So it is the teacher union's activities in pursuit of their self-interest that have made this a very partisan issue. And until that changes, until the teachers themselves stand up and say, actually, let's start focusing again on the kids rather than our political power, that is going to remain. And so there isn't a bipartisan option until somehow or other Democrats start standing up to the teacher union and saying there's a better way.
Well, is that going to happen, Robert?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually going to sort of disagree with Jim maybe a little bit here.
Shocking.
I agree that Jim's assessment about the nature of how this became a partisan thing. But I think, as Milton Friedman always used to say, this is an issue of leadership. And if you actually look at support and you look at African-American entrepreneurship and look at desires of families on the ground and see that there's an amazing opportunity to lift everyone up, and particularly Black entrepreneurs and Black owners and Black leaders of educational offices, I think it's the way the way to get to bipartisanship is by recognizing that all we're wanting is best for our kids. All of us want the same thing, and we need to empower everyone to do that as bottom-up kind of strategy. I've been talking about, Derrell has been talking about funding students, not systems. I think until we get the leadership is going away. I mean, I'm watching, what I'm most worried about in this movement, to come to the House divided conversation, is that the old leadership in the urban communities who was not supportive of what families wanted, in my opinion, particularly their constituent families, is being replaced by a reform group of people who will tell those families what's the best option for them, rather than empower them to do the right thing. And I think that's where I'm worried about a House divided, and I can't wait to hear Derrell's comment to that.
Well, let me pick up on that, Robert. So maybe you all saw the recent American Enterprise Institute study, and it found that I think it was 3 votes out of 70 required any Democratic support to move forward legislation. And I think that the main argument in that study, it sort of raised the question, does school choice need to have a bipartisan appeal? Because all of these 70 votes that move forward, no Democrats were needed. So I don't know if you saw this recent study, and just kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm going to go first because I have a quick, real opinion on this one. One, you need to have a red state strategy in a red state, a blue state strategy in a blue state, a purple state strategy in a purple state. That does not mean in a red state you don't have a blue outreach, and in a blue state you don't have a red outreach. It's just ridiculous to say that you can't understand the political situation and try to embrace all sides, in my personal opinion. Moreover, while Jay is right in his research about that, he pointed out something, he didn't talk about all the Republican states that failed. See Texas as an example, right? See many other Republican states that have failed for years. And so while it is true, it is factual that you didn't need Republicans in these 70 votes, it is not true that more Republicans necessarily will vote over the long haul for school choice, because in the history of school choice and school reform, more Republicans have voted against it. It's my opinion.
Derrell.
Yeah, I mean, that's a strong case, which I tend to agree with. And I would just say this as a person who votes in Democratic primaries and works in blue states. I think Robert's hypothesis or his analysis is spot on. I also think it's a mistake to sort of give up on having blue strategies, which is kind of what I think who I respect a great deal, is what I think Jay postulates we should do. And I don't think we should do that because if you look at polling among Democrats, right? Democrats as a whole, school choice, charter schools or whatever, support may be trending down as a whole, but among African Americans and Hispanics is through the roof. And so it is a mistake to characterize Democratic support of any of these policies at the constituent level as uniform, right? I think we all know that the average Black Democrat is significantly more conservative than the average white progressive. And in offering that, I would just also say, I think it is a great mistake. It's almost like a mania to make the pursuit of white progressives the white whale of school choice policy reform, which is basically what it has been. And so all we're doing all the time is beating our head against trying to get the person who benefits the most from the public system as currently constructed, who is, as David Brooks wrote in his piece, The Rich White Civil War of a couple of years ago, the most equipped to say no, basically, and most well positioned to avoid any consequences of that no. We're trying to convince that person instead of every other person who is not that person. And I think that is a tragic misalignment of limited resources.
Well, Derrell, you're absolutely right. If you look at the voting, the public opinion on the ground, you see very strong support for the school choice options that are out there among Hispanic Americans and among African Americans, and you don't see the same level of support among white Americans. But then at the same time, you see all these civil rights groups from all kinds of backgrounds saying, marching lockstep with the teacher unions, as Jim Blue sort of lays it out. It's not just the teacher unions, they've got the whole civil rights community with them saying we've got to save our public schools and we can't allow ourselves to be distracted by these efforts to siphon off money from our public schools. So how is the rank and file support for choice ever going to become an organized political force given the state of the civil rights community today?
Yeah, Jim, did you want to go?
You start.
Okay, so I looked at the chat. I see Jen Wagner popping it off, and she's making some really good points. So if you're in the chat, whatever. But the one thing I would just say is that, so there's the policy. So school choice is like a policy and it's an experience, right? It's a policy set and it's an experience. And I think what we find is that people have incredible support for the experience and don't articulate that support to the policy. So when somebody says, voucher, people are like, oh, that's terrible, But when somebody says, my baby got a scholarship to this hoity-toity independent, all boys Episcopalian day school and is on a path to like a wonderful career, everybody's clapping and psyched about it, right? And so I don't know whether or not I describe that as a communications failure. I do think that one of the keys to rationalizing the political support for choice overall, like the bucket of policies, is getting people to realize that they themselves actually enjoy choice in education, right? Would hate to have it taken away, and that our policy set is the thing that enshrines that, right? That helps it grow, that makes it work. We have not done a good job of that. I mean, if you ask like most people still think a charter school is a private school, right? They see the plaid and they're like, so when is chapel, And the majority of Americans think a charter is a bus, right? Because the majority of Americans have not been into a charter school, right? The things that we talk about fail to meet the scale of experience necessary to sort of stick with that constituency in the way that I think you provoke, sir. So that would be my kind of take on it.
Jim, can you add to that?
Well, what I personally want to add, so the three of us have been involved in these battles at the state legislators for a couple of decades now. And I want to go back to Jay's study. It's convenient to look at the votes because that's where we have data, but I can just tell you the dynamics in those legislatures. It's helpful to neutralize particularly the African-American Democrats in a legislature. If they're not saying, we got to kill this, no way, it changes the dynamic and allows us to get the necessary votes. So that's point one. The second point is what Rob and Derrell have touched on. Look, your question around the civil rights groups is a daunting one. The three of us know, and we don't know how to articulate how effective the teacher unions have been at enticing those formal groups to their position, even though it is out of sync with their constituents. I have to believe that the truth will out there, that eventually, no matter how much support they're getting from the teacher unions or from the apparatus, that eventually they'll come around and want to support what their constituents need and deserve. But again, I might be optimistic. I have no data that that's going to happen, but I am hopeful that eventually the civil rights groups will all say, this is a civil rights issue. We need to make sure that people in our community are getting educated.
And I'm just going to jump in here real quick to say, Daniel, I think there are groups like what Chris Stewart's doing, like what Derrell is doing, like what Sharif El-Mekki is doing, to try and to have these conversations in the Black community. And I think that's super important because as I've been thinking more during this conversation about a house divided, I wonder if the division really isn't over those of us who think that I'm going to put more than 50% of my trust and belief in parents and educators, and those that think that less than 50% are should be trusting parents or educators. And I think if you think about it that way, then this crosses party lines beyond a shadow of a doubt. In our office, a wonderful program through our training and outreach department with Emory Edwards is starting this millennial convenings of Black leaders. And it's just amazing to see them as they talk about the ability to own their own education system, how the lights go on, right? And how they, oh my God, I can own my own education. I can own my own kids' education. That's something I never thought of before in our system. And I think if we speak the language of what parents really want and need, I think we're going to bridge a divide that might exist in the first place.
Let me ask you, so all of you are for a diversity of options and to some extent a diversity of viewpoints within the choice movement, but there have been some out there who have kind of shown that in some cases, different options, different groups may be fighting for a small pie. So a good example might be in cities where you have Catholic schools, and some have come out and shown descriptive reports where charter schools come on the scene and then Catholic schools precipitously decline and kind of disappear. So the city of Detroit might be an example where some have said charter schools really kind of carved up the Catholic schools in that city. And there's other cities where others have made similar arguments. So I'm wondering, do some of these choice options, are they just inevitably going to be at odds with each other in certain spaces?
Well, look, you're making an unfair comparison. And you'll notice that the three of us talk a lot about how all of this gets financed. So what we're looking for is equal opportunity with the money, so that if I am a parent, I can literally make a choice between a Catholic school, Montessori school, public school, whatever. What's happened, and I think it's actually quite a shame, the decline of Catholic schools in this country. It is not only due to charter schools, although charter schools take a lot of blame for that. But if you look at what happened, like there's a lot of misinformed press talking about how the Catholic schools are all over-enrolled, all of it. The reality is that in our low-income, middle-class communities, we lost 200 Catholic schools this last year. And that's due to the fact that parents wanted to make the choice, but there's a lot of economic uncertainty. Philanthropy started to die for the Catholic churches, dioceses. And so, it was an unfair playing field. I believe those schools would have been opened if parents had the power to choose it, but because of economics, they did not. And that's the other thing, that's getting lost in this conversation, particularly Derrell and me and Rob as well. We got into this movement because what we saw happening in our low-income communities with people of color across this country. And there are, we have all kinds of data that we're not even teaching half the kids to read in these schools. And yet we still pretend like our system is doing a good job. And it's sort of the anger behind our movement. How are we putting up with that when we as a country should be doing much, much better?
And Daniel, 30, and I'm just going to use Indiana because Jen's been talking about it in the chat. Indiana's got this great, robust environment, but still, even in that city, one of our school districts, of the 1,000 Black boys in the system, only 30 could pass the combined portion of math and reading. 30 out of 1,000. That's what you see in the anger, but because then people are saying we should continue to fund that system the same way. And your question about charters and choice, it's a smaller niche or marketplace because the way we finance education means that because it's free at the point of delivery, because it's compulsory, and because it's based on where you live, you're giving a market advantage, to use that language, sorry, an advantage to traditional school systems, right? And so think about it like Milton Friedman always used to say about hot dog stands, and I'm not comparing education to hot dog, but hot dog stands in New York. Let's say every corner hot dog stand, the government says this is now going to be a government operated hot dog stand. Which would be the type of hot dog stands left to survive in that environment? One, the high elite hot dog stands for the wealthy, and the subsidized religious kosher hot dog stands. And that's sort of the kind of involvement we have right now in K-12 education. Because the way we finance it, the actual choices for families are much smaller than they could be if we truly empower families to make choices from a whole host of different options.
Yeah, I just want to, the internet gods played me out, so let's see what my phone does. I have always taken the position that Catholic schools in particular, like, should not lose because of price. If you lose to charter schools because your offering is not better, that is one thing. If you lose because free is the point of differentiation, that is another, right? And I just say that to sort of build on my comments of earlier about like building a system of finance that actually enables like a market for education choice, right? Like a choice that is more diverse and sort of atomized even than buying a different seat, which is a model we have now. The other thing I just want to speak to it because again, like Jen is popping off in the chat and she's getting all kinds of hollers up here. You know, at 50 Can, we are like the black sheep of a house divided. You know why? Because we believe that navigating divisions is an essential feature of passing policies that improve the world for kids who don't have a leg up against these systems. And a lot of people think that driving the division, right, being the most recalcitrant, right, being the most obstreperous, right, is the position to take, and that is the position that is best for families. And I disagree with that. Like, that's not how I came up in the movement. You don't win politics by subtraction, right? This isn't a game of subtraction. And most importantly, I think, you know, there's this African proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone, right? If you want to go far, go together. And every time we do something like this, right, kind of to Jay's data, where we build the entire proposal on division and exclusion, you might get it done fast, but then it gets unstuck. The next time when the next guy's in charge, they unwind what you did. And the only way you build environments, policy environments, right, where kids don't have to worry about whether or not a local district is going to allow their charter school to expand to the 5th grade, right, which is a real thing right now, as a way to inhibit people from staying in a school they want, right, because, oh, no, there's no 5th grade or something like that, is by building larger, more diverse, political, economic, racial, location, constituencies to support the right of a parent to get the education that works best for them and their kid. Like every single time, you got, like, you say it out loud, you got to believe it, you got to mean it. And it hurts to say it right now because division is rewarded. That kind of action is penalized, but we're going to stay in the penalty box on it.
So Robert, this is a moment in time where education has come up as a major issue in the gubernatorial election. It has not happened for some time. It's an off-year election, a very unusual thing, but it's a purple state, Virginia. And we have a political novice emerging from nowhere, campaigning for school choice and also saying that the public school system just completely failed during the pandemic. All the themes that we have heard expressed this morning or this afternoon. So is this an inflection moment? There's a comment in the chat here that the Democratic Party has to suffer if they're going to modify their opinion and no longer be at the mercy of the teacher unions. Is this an inflection point in Virginia?
So I was gonna, go ahead, Rob.
Jim should answer that question, but I'm just going to make one comment, and that is, I think it's an inflection point for the nation. And I really want to turn to Jen's comment in the chat where Miss Sarah from Memphis Lift said, what we're doing is slow and respectful work, and we need to be aware of that because we're dealing with different communities. Jim, you're the political guy that knows more.
Well, no, I really like that last point. It's an important one. And, it's easier to see our movement over decades when you've been involved in it over decades. And we've made a lot of progress. And we make progress when there are many of us going down the road together. I was going to point to the Virginia election to respond to Dr. Wolf's earlier question. And he wanted to know what evidence we had. What I wanted to point out is that we do have evidence that it's politically dangerous, even for Democrats, to stand up and say parents should be discounted. Because we watched the polls flip in Virginia after the Democrat candidate, the former governor, Terry McAuliffe, said parents should, their decisions should not matter when it comes to their education. That has hurt him more than the promotion of school choice from young.
So, Derrell?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the guy running against former Governor McAuliffe from Adam. But I think to Jim's point, like he, as much as he still is pulling the like talking points from 2018 or whatever about former Secretary DeVos and the former president, his real challenge is just the complete and utter like tone deafness to the fact that after a year and a half, almost 2 years of incredibly disrupted institutional experience that was visited on almost every family in the country, you probably shouldn't say something like parents don't matter, right? You probably should not say that. You and your political guy, y'all need to go talk, because that's the bad thing to say. And so either, right, he is incredibly poorly advised, or kind of to Jim's point, the take for him, right? And I won't speak for him as all Democrats. I think you guys know I happen to be one, right? Is so ensconced in how the school board and sort of like traditional school governance apparatus thinks about the world, that he basically has blinders on for every other thing. So like, I don't know anything about the other guy. I think that, the fact that he was down by like 8 and now it's like within the margin of error, and that independents have been the swing, I think is very telling. I think there is a lesson there. It's not even a school choice lesson. You could make it a school choice lesson, but there's a lesson there about treating people poorly who've been treated poorly. And if you're too arrogant to get that message, well, whatever happens, happens.
We're nearing the end of the hour. Paul, do you all think we have time for one more question? There's a few questions in the chat about, if I were to summarize them, they seem to be about what's the future? And if I'm listening to you all correctly, I hear you talking a lot about mixes of learning opportunities, which makes me think of ESAs. So is that where you see things going? What are your thoughts on the future of school choice?
Yeah, from a policy perspective, I totally agree. The parents really want to curate their children's own education, and so you got to give them more flexibility. So ESA, politically, what I think we'll see, or what I'm hoping we'll see, is that the labor union that represents teachers will start declining in power, and the teachers, the classroom teachers themselves, their voice will be raised, and we'll be able to get ourselves out of a horrible situation we're in.
I would just say, so I agree with what Jim just said, and I think Robert probably will too. All school choice reform is finance reform, right? And to the extent that you want to make the choices more nuanced, you have to build, a more nuanced way to fund it all. And ESA is obviously like a great paradigm to think about that all in. That said, one of the things that I found most exciting is the parallel market for teachers that has opened up. Because teachers are paid and regulated in a monopolistic way across in most of the country, and that limits their opportunities too. And I think now you could, if you're a good teacher, you could be like, listen, I want to teach five kids at price point X, and our values match, and let's do it, right? And you don't have to be step and lane anymore, right? We can go to a model for them where, believe it or not, the results matter. right? You get paid more for results. I mean, that's really interesting, you know? So nobody wants to talk about that. I think the labor paradigm is currently constructed is very bad for teachers. And obviously has significant deleterious effects for kids. And I would love to see the growth of this, like the independent itinerant teacher, the pod teacher, the facilitator, the market for tutors, like that excites me a great deal.
And I think the only thing I would add to that, because I agree with all of that, of course, except I think there's a real problem with information and transparency in our systems, in our education. So you can't have true reform over time or transformation over time if we don't have clear information and clear lines of information for families. And, you know, I can look at our work starting to say, well, how do you bridge the gap between there's an opportunity to choose and there's knowledge to choose? And I think that's part of the future of our reform movement, is figuring that gap out.
Well, thank you all for your energy, your commitment, for your knowledge, and for sharing it all with us today. We look forward to another session of our conference on the school choice in the post-pandemic era. It will be on the 29th of October, and we're going to look at, does the Constitution require school choice? There are a lot of cases coming up. So thank you, Robert. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Derrell, for a very lively session. And thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.